if aliens have been among us, have visited, are in communication of any sort. Either they are benign, they wish us well, or they don't. If they don't, is there anything that we're going to do about it? If they have visited us, if they're among us, and they have decided not to explicitly communicate with us, then we're just going to have to face the cold reality that they're just not into us. That people have gotten accustomed to governments making decisions for us. I would not count on the next pandemic being a pandemic, if you know what I mean. A perfect vaccine, right? There's no such thing, of course. But imagine, would the government have the right to tell you that you had to take it? And again, I think the answer has to be no. We shouldn't be, as a matter of public policy, arguing about the science of vaccinations. I believe in a complete separation of state and science, in the same way that we all as Americans believe in a complete separation of church and state. I just don't think that we want science to be controlled by the government.
Today, we are joined by Mike ter Maat, the vice presidential nominee for the Libertarian Party. He's running alongside Chase Oliver. In 2021, Mike ran in the special election in Florida's 20th district. Before entering politics, he was a police officer, substitute public school teacher, and a financial economist at the Office of Management and Budget. Mike is also extensively educated with a bachelor's degree in Aeronautical Engineering, Master of Business Administration, Master of Science, and a PhD in economics. Stay tuned as me and Mike discuss everything from Space Force and aliens to the next pandemic and the inverted yield curve. How do you feel about childless cat ladies? It seems to be all anybody wants to talk about in the media.
That seemed like a stupid comment, didn't it? Oh, my Lord.
I thought it did, for a party that has trouble with women.
Well, for anybody. I don't find that to be an appropriate comment no matter who you are.
We'll get on to some more serious questions here. When looking at your background, I noticed you kind of had done a lot of different things. You wore a lot of hats in your career. So I want to ask you about Space Force. I know you went to school for Aeronautical Engineering, and I thought you probably have a little bit better grasp on this topic than most people in Congress or politicians. Do you think that Space Force is a worthy branch of the military? Would you get rid of it? I know libertarians love to slash and cut programs and get rid of whole departments.
No, I don't think that we need a Space Force. I think that we should be reaching agreements politically with nations around the world, but I don't think that we should be deploying military assets in outer space. And I think that this is a major potential stepping stone toward conflict that would be very difficult to control. So I don't like it any which way. I think it also needs to be said that the federal government of the United States is not an organization that you should be given to trusting in terms of its attitude toward the projection of military power. This is an organization that uses your money against your will to project a foreign policy that does not align with your values, that develops this foreign policy largely in the shadows. And so when it comes to you and says we need greater resources for a Space Force, trust us in the way that we're going to deploy assets, it just doesn't foster a lot of faith in those of us who pay attention to it.
Okay. Very libertarian answer. Get rid of it. I like it. Reading your bio, again, you did something different. You were a police officer. I don't know how you went from aeronautical engineering to being a cop for a decade, but I was just wondering, as a libertarian, did your head kind of explode in that role? I'm sure you saw a lot of corruption, a lot of abuse of power, police brutality. What was that like? And from your firsthand experience, how would you reform policing?
No, I had a very good experience as a police officer. I was a cop from age 49 to 60, which is to say until just a couple of years ago. I was very lucky. I worked with a very good agency. I was able to find an agency that had a separate vice unit and a separate traffic unit. So I didn't have to get involved with the stuff that I personally consider stupid. I didn't have to get involved with the war on drugs or, vice, prostitution stings and asset forfeiture and all that silliness. So, I had a good experience. And because of a separate traffic unit, I didn't have to get all involved with whether or not the town wanted, traffic ticket citations to make a contribution toward revenue goals or anything like that. So I had a good experience. No, we did not have situations like people see in the media about, physical abuse and that sort of thing going on. Look, there are important reforms that I believe that we need to make to our criminal justice system, and that's on two different tracks. One is, I think that just what it is that we criminalize in the United States doesn't make a lot of sense. This idea of a war on drugs through the use of criminal statutes, through the criminal code, I think it's mixing apples and oranges, and I've got an ethical problem with it, but as a practical matter, I think a lot of cops would tell you that the war on drugs just doesn't work. The other aspect of reform that I think is so important is that we need to do a better job of holding police officers accountable. In my own view, that requires making the business of policing look more like other businesses, like more like other industries. You want an environment in which the best police officers, agencies compete for the best officers. You want the best officers to get paid more. You want the mediocre officers to get paid less, and you want the crappy officers to be fired. And that's what we want in other public sector professions as well. We want teaching to look more like other industries, for example. We've gotten away from what are basic economic principles that have put us in pretty good shape in the rest of the American economy, but we have left all that go by the wayside when it comes to policing and teaching.
I got one more about your background. I also read that you were a financial economist at the Office of Budget and Management. So I was curious how much government waste you might have seen while you were there, any sort of reckless spending, maybe something Americans don't hear about through the media. What was that experience like working inside the beast?
It's a tough job. The Office of Management and Budget is really a blocking and tackling kind of job. It's not full of policy pronouncements and anything that you might accidentally think is glamorous. That's for sure. Look, as a young, fiscally conservative economist, it was a real disappointment to see that the White House caved on what had been George Herbert Walker Bush's promise. You'll have to ask your parents about this, but when he had famously said, Congress will come looking for more taxes, and I'll say, read my lips, no new taxes. When he went back on that, it was a real turning point for a lot of folks, for me in particular, when you realize that the Republican Party is not as dedicated to financial, fiscal conservatism as you may have thought, as you may have hoped, that politics really does trump good decision making. It's a discouraging time. I think that was probably the beginning of the end of a long relationship between me and the Republican Party. I think a lot of other folks would say the same thing. And now we see how that has played out over the past decades. I don't think anyone would seriously make the case that the Republican Party is a fiscally conservative policy making organization. I just don't think that they would even make that argument in a full-throated fashion themselves. I remained a Republican, at least on paper, for a long while after that. I did work for the 92 campaign, 96 a little bit, campaigned a little bit for Governor Bush in 98. I didn't really participate in politics for a long time. I registered as a libertarian only in about 2011 or so, around the time I became a police officer in a second career. And at the time, honestly, obviously I came to libertarianism from what I would call the right side, the right hand side, which is to say, believing in economic efficiency, believing that the world would be a better place if if we were all made better decisions, and those decisions are better when you make them for yourselves than when the government makes them for you. But being a libertarian, coming to libertarianism later in life, you realize the importance of coming, in my view, coming to libertarianism from also what I would call the left-hand side, which is to say, even if it were not true that the government is unable to make decisions for you that are as good as the ones that you make for yourself. In other words, imagine a world in which socialism worked, which is a weird thing to say. Imagine that world. Would the government have the right to make decisions for you? If the government could make better decisions for you than you could yourself, which is a weird thought experiment, but work with me. If the government could make decisions for you that are better than the ones that you would make, would the government have the right to do so? And I think the answer has got to be no. And that's what I mean by coming to libertarianism from the other side, from the left-hand side, as a matter of principle, as a matter of ethics. I do believe that it is true that you have an inherent God-given right to pursue your life, to pursue your goals, to set your goals, to live your life by your own standards. But I also believe that it is true, Courtney, that you have in some sense an obligation to live your own life. I don't believe it is an ethical proposition for anyone to forfeit over to the government decision-making authority over their life, even if for some weird reason you believe that the government would make better decisions for you. I still think it's your obligation to pursue that path that is yours to walk.
Do you think most people could ever really have a libertarian ideology? I feel like most Americans are a little too lazy to want to make their own decisions. Do you think that's maybe the stumbling block why people want the government to tell them what to do and how to behave and how to live? Or do you think it's just an education problem? They don't understand how they're getting screwed by the government.
Well, we're going to find out over the next couple of decades, aren't we? I do think that there is largely the latter, an education problem. I'm optimistic that it's not merely people want others to make decisions for them. And I do think that there's sort of a mix of the two, which is to say, I think that people have gotten accustomed to governments making decisions for us, for each other, right? For you, for me. And so I think that there's sort of a resignation. Why should I even think about making certain decisions? The government wouldn't let me kind of attitude, right? But I do think that there are large and important examples that Americans recognize, if not, ex ante, at least ex post. They understand afterwards that the government has taken liberty away from them. I think that most Americans look back at the COVID regime, for example, and realize the government should not be in the business of deciding for you whether or not you should take a vaccine. However you feel about vaccines, it is a decision that it should be for you to make. It should not be for the government at any level to coerce you into making such decision. And in that sense, I sometimes get very annoyed when this discussion goes into a scientific area, because it's my feeling that science should have nothing to do with it. In other words, if a vaccine were perfect, if another thought experiment, imagine a perfect vaccine. If you took it, you were going to live, and if you didn't, 100% certainty you were going to die. It had no side effects. It was perfectly free. It's been tested and shuts down 100%, shuts down transmissibility. A perfect vaccine, right? There's no such thing, of course. But imagine, would the government have the right to tell you that you had to take it? And again, I think the answer has to be no. That it's, and therefore this isn't a matter of science. We shouldn't be, as a matter of public policy, arguing about the science of vaccination.
Do you think that there's going to be another pandemic soon? You get online, you get in the far corners of conspiracy holes, go down the rabbit hole. People think another one's going to come up to try to take our freedoms or, move the election a certain direction. Do you think that's possible, or do you think the powers that be will try something different next time to
I think the evidence suggests that while this virus was apparently man-made, I don't think that the evidence suggests that this group of people intentionally unleashed it. I am open to learning otherwise, and I think it's a real shame that we cannot trust with certainty that the whole thing wasn't intentional, right? I think that that's possibly the greatest shame of all. There will be future, whether you believe it was intentional or not, there will be future pandemics. I don't think there's any question about that. We need to learn what it is I think that the government learned. The government learned that if you play your cards right, you can make people do a lot of weird crap. And this is a lesson that we need to learn as well. We need to learn exactly the same lesson as government officials learned, and to protect ourselves from the government the next time this happens. By the way, I would not count on the next pandemic being a pandemic, if you know what I mean. I wouldn't count on the next catastrophe the government officials want to leverage in order to compromise our civil liberties. I wouldn't count on that being, a virus or even a medical condition. There are things that come up all the time, right? Wars, cyber attacks, climate change, right? Weather patterns, weather disasters. There are all kinds of disasters that people fear, naturally. And in many cases, we believe, correctly or incorrectly, that governments at some level were created to help deal with some of these problems. And so naturally, government officials are all too willing to step into certain roles to say, we are here to save you, we're here to protect you, you can trust us. And we know that this is where authoritarianism comes from in a democracy. When I was a young economist 100,000 years ago, we used to make fun of other democracies around the world. Maybe not fun, but we would ridicule other democracies around the world when you would see a growing sense of authoritarianism. And we know where it comes from. It comes from a politician saying, what you have to fear is not so much the loss of your civil liberties. What you really have to fear is that other idiot coming to power. Right? You need to trust me. I'm the one who can protect you. I'm the one who can save you from that. And that is, of course, exactly the pattern that we see in the United States. We see the Republicans and Democrats have effectively given up on what had been their political agenda, right? The number one objective of the Republican Party is to keep Democrats out of power. I don't think that most Republicans would argue with you about that. And the same thing about members of the Democratic Party, Democratic politicians. They would say the same thing. This is where authoritarianism comes from. It comes from giving up on your political agenda and claiming that the other side is a threat to democracy and I'm here to save you. And so a natural disaster, whether it's a pandemic or anything else, or man-made disaster perhaps, these things always provide a useful vehicle for politicians to instill fear and claim that they are uniquely positioned to save you. As long as that other jerk doesn't come to power, everything's going to be okay.
We play the same game every 4 years, don't we? We think things are going to change.
We absolutely do, and sometimes more frequently than that.
What would be a libertarian's response to a massive disaster, another pandemic, or even a cyber attack? We had that huge one a few weeks ago. If you're vice president, Chase Oliver's president, how would a libertarian respond? Because I know libertarians don't really like to do anything with federal power. So how does that play out when there is a big problem?
Well, you certainly don't want the federal government making decisions for you, but to the extent to which we believe that we need a defense capability, personally, I believe that that defense capability needs to be reoriented toward online attacks. And I think that to be real effective in the future, the Defense Department of the United States federal government is going to have to do a much better job. And in fairness, it has been working in the right direction, but it has to do a much better job of creating dialogue and partnerships with private sector organizations. In the main, with large, at least ubiquitous private sector organizations, I got the impression that the Defense Department was completely taken off guard by the CrowdStrike software update failure. I got the impression that private sector organizations were completely caught off guard as well. This is the kind of thing that we need to, as a society, need to be much, much better at responding to. One of the things that makes me nervous is federal government officials looking at that situation and saying, well, this is evidence that we need more control and more power to prevent this from happening in the future. I think that's exactly the wrong lesson to take away. The lesson is that centralized authority and power, once it trips into a problem, that spreads like wildfire through the economy, that you need a decentralized set of solutions. But there are times when you need information and coordination that does not need to come from the government, but to the extent to which the Defense Department is going to be in the business of protecting the federal government, I would like to see them take the lead in coordinating defense for the private sector as well. But that has to be merely a coordinating role. It cannot be a command and control role.
I want to get into a couple real specific policy issues. So, first one, the yield curve has been inverted for more than 624 days. That makes it the longest on record, and that's normally an indicator that a recession or a depression is coming our way. When do you think we'll hit a full-blown recession? How bad will it be? And then, of course, what would your administration do to calm everybody down and stop it or prevent it the best they can?
Well, look, we can spend days talking about it, and maybe we should. The short answer is nobody knows and nothing. The 600 days is a long time. You can look at that and say, well, that means a recession is absolutely in the cards that have already been dealt. You can also look at that and say, well, maybe the yield curve inversion isn't the predictor that we thought it was. I do think that a recession is coming. I think that the yield curve has been messed up by messed up policy coming out of the Fed and a weird set of expectations that has created. One of the problems the big problem I have with Fed monetary policy is that it makes it very difficult to predict where our economy is going. Investors have to predict not only what it is that interest rates are indicating, but what interest rates are indicating in the context of guessing Fed policy. So it is messed up. Is the yield curve inverted because people anticipate recession, or is the yield curve inverted because people anticipate the Fed expecting recession and taking action? It's much more complicated than it should be, than it needs to be. Personally, I believe that we need to get the Fed out of discretionary monetary policy, that we need to replace the Federal Reserve's monetary policy system with a rules-based system that says merely that we are going to allow the expansion of money stock at a fixed rate, a fixed, determined, pre-announced, I don't even care what the number is, right? We can argue about whether that number should be 2% or 3% or 4% or whatever, but it should be something that basically targets a 0% inflation, something that accommodates real growth, but does not accommodate any nominal growth beyond that, that does not accommodate any fixed target for price increases like the Fed has now. The Fed targets 2% inflation now, which is, of course, a political construct, which is a very weird thing. I believe that we need to replace the Fed with a rule that says we're going to allow the money supply to increase by, say, 3% per year, and we need to adhere to that. And then we wouldn't have to wonder, well, is the yield curve inverted for this reason or for that reason? And it would become a much more usefully predictive tool. Yeah, I think a recession is coming. It's very difficult to know when, how deep, what that impact will be. But we do know that the Fed has had pretty profound, I don't know if I want to use the word wild swings, but pretty profound swings in policy over the past 3 years. Of course, we all understand that the federal government should not have been ordering shutdowns in the face of COVID. That's a real shame. And that's where, that's where the original sin of this particular business cycle started. And then the Fed felt compelled to lower rates, pump money into the economy to avoid a deep depression. And we've been dealing with the aftershocks of that ever since. I don't think there's any question that Fed tightening rates the past 2 years is the reason we're looking at a potential recession now. That's a real shame. I hope that all your viewers rode the increase in the stock market up until last week, but that also means you're going to have to either have guessed correctly last week and gotten out, or ride it back on the way down and hope for a turn in the not too distant future. It is a long-term play, right? Not a short-term play. But you have to recognize that the ride up for the stock market the past year has been, largely in reaction to increases in the money supply, to the change in the Fed policy. So you got to take the sour with the sweet. It's a real problem, but it is a problem that is man-made. And that's my problem with the Fed's monetary policy.
So it kind of seemed like almost like managing the Fed a little bit better. You're talking about setting the rate, making it stay the same. Are you more of, I think I can reform the Fed, or you want to get rid of the Fed?
I would get rid of the Fed. I would get rid of the Fed lock, stock, and barrel. I would start by ending discretionary monetary policy and just target a growth rate in the money base. That's how that would be my first step. By the way, I think that most Americans would be absolutely shocked if you were to tell them that the way the most important price in the world is set is that every 6 weeks we lock up a dozen really smart people and we basically ask them what mood they're in about the economy. That is not a metaphor. That is literally how we do it. I think most Americans would say, well, first of all, I think most Americans would say, no, that's not how it's done. Right? No, you don't understand. That's not how it's done. And then I think that those whom you could convince, no, really, the world's most important price, short-term interest rates on the American dollar, the most important price in the world is set in this complete discretionary fashion. If you could convince most Americans that that is actually true, I think most of them would say, that's stupid. You would not accept your government making that decision in that fashion for the price of eggs. You would say that's stupid. And it is stupid. And that's the truth of the matter, is that it's stupid. We know from research and experience that we would be better off with a rules-based system instead of a discretionary system. And look, I spent decades working with Fed economists. I have every respect for their hard work, their intelligence, their patriotism, their faith in what it is they're doing. But after 100 years, you have to finally admit, it is not a system that works as well as we had hoped. It is not a system that mitigates the boom-bust cycle. It's not a system that you can trust to avoid bailouts and creating weird incentives for the next cycle. It's not a system that you can trust to regulate financial institutions in a way that works out best in the long run. Everything that the Fed does, it doesn't do as well as we would have hoped, and that most Americans believe that is true. And I think that in every one of these areas that we trust to the Fed, there is a better way of doing business.
Now, I know you really like the gold standard and you want to get back on it. I was hoping you could kind of dive into that.
Well, we don't have to get all the way back to the gold standard. I think that we need to get rid of discretionary policy, but I would control the money stock. I wouldn't go all the way back to the gold standard. The problem with the gold standard is that you're picking one commodity to hook to. And I just don't see that one particular commodity as being something that I feel like worshiping.
I noticed on your website you mentioned the International Health Regulation Amendments, and I hardly ever hear anybody talk about this. It's a huge deal. If Americans knew what was going on, their heads would explode. Could you dive into that, explain to the audience what they are, first of all, and then why they're so dangerous?
There's a couple of aspects to this that I think are important. First of all, I don't think, similar to the Fed, I don't think most Americans realize the decisions that are made for them. I don't think that Americans realize the extent to which regulations are made regarding the medical industry that preclude you from, for example, seeing medicines that other nations have access to, that other nations have access to in a timely fashion. I don't think most Americans realize that when a medicine is eventually brought to market, that it's done so in the vast majority of instances by companies that have complete protection from civil liability. So that if there are side effects and downsides, they're going to be protected, and therefore they don't do the cost-benefit analysis the way that you would hope and the way that you would want courts to help enforce. For markets to work correctly, people have to be held accountable for the things that go wrong as well as the things that go right. That's one example. Another is that I think that most Americans would eventually agree, back to your question about whether it's a matter of ethics or education, I think that most Americans would eventually agree that you don't want your government involved in science. I believe in a complete separation of state and science, in the same way that we all as Americans believe in a complete separation of church and state. I just don't think that we want science to be controlled by the government. I think that we want the government in the business of making sure our markets work correctly. Once in a while, that might mean a regulation. As a libertarian, I believe that those examples are very, very few and far between. We want to make sure that our courts work correctly. But this idea that the government should be deciding what science is researched, how that research is conducted, which research gets funding and which doesn't, the idea that an agency, and apologies to all of your Anthony Fauci fans out there, the idea that you should have an agency that is both responsible for regulating how research is conducted and receiving financial remuneration from the development of certain drugs from that same research, I think most Americans would be shocked to find out that we legally tolerate these sorts of conflicts of interest, that we legally tolerate the way that business is done in the United States regarding the development of drugs. And that's just the backdrop for the idea that the United States engages in coordination with other agencies around the world, including the World Health Organization, for example, but others as well, and coordinate in order to effectively suppress competition. What we really want done is for various nations to create environments in which medicine is practiced, medicines are developed, irrespective of how other nations do it. We want to be able to learn what works best. We want competition for businesses as well as for medical professionals, medical industries, so we can learn what works best. All you need to know is to look at the Biden administration's example regarding corporate income tax to know what their attitude is about competition. The Biden administration believes that international organizations should be used to set a worldwide corporate income tax rate. And the reason they say they want this is to make sure that there is no competition. They explicitly say they don't want a world in which corporations can move from one nation to another when nations compete to provide, to develop a good pro-business environment. They don't want that. They want to be able to control businesses and keep businesses from moving so that they can exert all the control that they want, even if it's bad for the business, to trap the business geographically. That attitude is what plays out in the development of our medical industries in exactly the same way. And so, yes, I believe that we do need a constitutional amendment that says we're going to keep the government away from our medical practices in the same way that we're going to keep our government away from our religious practices, our scientific practices. We don't want a government making all these decisions at the corporate level, and we sure as heck don't want a government making decisions for us at a personal level. The idea that a government should even help you make up your own mind regarding a vaccine, I find a very, very strange thing. I'm not going to list for your constituents all of the personal medical decisions in your lives, right? But just think about it for a moment. There are lots of decisions that you have to make for yourself, some of which might have consequences for others, theoretically, possibly, especially in a cost sense. Do you really want the government weighing in on these things? And before you answer that, consider how good the government has been at figuring out what's good for you and what's not good for you in the past. Just think about the most simple, think about diet. The most simple, right? The government used to tell us, in some corners still does, that the basic building block of your diet should be white flour. And for generations told us this. That's a weird thing.
Yeah.
Is this an organization that you want making medical decisions for you?
Not in any way. Terrifies me to the core to think about that.
I think so. I think it should.
What is your thoughts on Bitcoin? I was at the Bitcoin conference a couple weeks ago. Trump and RFK were there, and they were definitely selling themselves to the crowd, anything to get a vote. They want to hold on and get a strategic reserve of Bitcoin. Is that a good idea? Is Bitcoin a good idea in and of itself? Where do you kind of stand on that issue? And why wasn't you or Chase Oliver there speaking? Or did they not ask?
You're going to have to ask them that. I do believe that the people who put that conference together are just not very interested in hearing different voices. It was a real shame in my view. I was very disappointed by their decision making. They should absolutely have had Chase speaking there as the presidential nominee of the third largest party in the United States. As a financial economist myself, by the way, a financial economist who has done a lot of work in the development of new currencies in my past, yeah,
Okay.
they should have had a libertarian voice there, and they didn't. So that's a weird thing.
It's funny because
But
I interviewed the chief of staff for the Bitcoin media before the conference, and I asked, I see Trump is there and RFK and a bunch of politicians. Is Chase Oliver going to show up? Did you all invite him?
We actually just haven't had a good conversation with him. I would be very open to having him. Most of our audience are libertarians, or at least the original audience of Bitcoiners are hardcore libertarians. So we'd be very open to having him. I don't know much about him though, so I would need to learn more and understand what he thinks about Bitcoin. I haven't even heard what his stance on Bitcoin is.
no, we asked. They said no.
Yeah, he
I
did
don't know.
not tell me that. He did not tell me that. That is really funny.
There's no gray area here. We asked. They said no. I don't know what else to tell you. No, of course. It's absolutely silly. Nobody would believe. Nobody smart enough to feed themselves could possibly believe something that dopey. No, they didn't want us there. I'm sure it's a business decision in some sense. It's just not one that I think is a very smart one. Look, the way that we approach this is like other markets. We want the government out of it because we want these markets to develop in the most efficient way possible. Any minute now, I don't know which year, but soon, we are going to hit an inflection point in the development of the smart economy. Much of the American economy, and then soon after the world economy, is going to be coordinated by contracts and orders running on blockchain technology. We know this. It is going to have a huge effect, a huge boon to efficiency in our economy. This is a very good thing, and it is coming. It will require the development of currency practices, much of which is known but not perfectly at this point. In other words, we don't know exactly what the characteristics are going to be of the perfect currencies in the future. For this reason, we need these markets to develop without government regulation. It's one of the big reasons that I believe that we need to keep the Federal Reserve System out of the issuance of its own blockchain-based currency, right? At the moment, the Fed says it's ready to roll it out retail, but it's waiting for enabling legislation from Congress. And one of my greatest fears is that they will eventually get tired of waiting, right? The Fed is an enormously politically powerful organization in Washington, as you know. And I have no doubt that they could argue that they have the authority. If they got it in their head to do so, I think that they could argue that they have the authority that they need to issue a blockchain-based technology, and off to the races that they would go. I think that's a real problem. And it's a problem for a couple of reasons. One is, as I mentioned, it would not only potentially crowd out other competing currencies, but that the Fed would issue a set of regulations that would advantage its own currency. And those regulations would pinch because the Fed would set itself up as an authority in clearing transactions, especially with the government, right? And with other existing clearinghouses. And so the Fed would have some weight to throw around, even if it were a brand new currency it would be creating. And so I worry very much about the development of that market. The other thing that needs to be said is that a lot of people would end up using a Fed issued currency. If it were to win the competition among blockchain based currencies, given these advantages the Fed would give itself, it means that the Fed would have access to information on an enormous proportion of transactions taking place in the world. And I don't think anyone should be fooled into believing that the Fed would not hand over this information to either the Justice Department or the Treasury Department for taxation purposes, that this would be the beginning of the end. Maybe we're already well beyond the beginning of the end of privacy for financial transactions in the United States, but this would be something that would accelerate the loss of privacy for Americans and citizens around the world. And I think that that's a very, very legitimate concern.
Couldn't agree more. Looks like we got about 15 minutes left, so try to switch gears here. Maybe a little bit lighter questions, hopefully. Well, probably not. What are your thoughts on the Trump's assassination? I wanted to get to that one before I have to let you go. Do you think it was an inside job, or do you think it was really?
Well, I don't think so. We don't have evidence that suggests that it was. I remain open to evidence that I find credible, but I think we're a long ways away from there. As a police officer, one thing that I have learned, that you learn as a police officer, is that you do have to wait for the preliminary investigation. We're a ways away from that. At that point, we'll be able to see, not perfectly, but we will get some insight as to what it is that these agencies are comfortable disclosing and not comfortable disclosing. And that might give you the first glimpse as to whether there's possibly some there that they're not that they're not putting forward. I suspect that this is as stupid as it looks. I think that people underestimate the effects of incompetence and lack of coordination. In other words, I think that a lot of conspiracy theories have come out of the idea that these agencies couldn't possibly be that stupid. Trust me, it's possible.
Okay, so it might just be ignorance. Don't go looking for something when it's just the government not knowing how to do anything properly, basically.
Well, right? Look, the first thing we need to do is fix what we know went wrong. Even if it were a government conspiracy, even if it were an Iranian conspiracy, an American conspiracy, no matter what's behind it, it's clear that a lot went wrong that day on site, right? So we know that we need to fix all of that to make ourselves resilient against the potential for a conspiracy. I'm not trying to say anything contradictory to the idea that it could be a conspiracy. You go back to 1963. The fact that a lot of decisions were badly made is a separate phenomenon to the fact that there was a conspiracy. And if we had been better at hardening our protection of the president, maybe we would have made it more difficult even for a conspiracy to succeed, I think is my point. If Because you're not going to convince me that local cops were in on it, right? That's not a thing that happens. And so, for example, if the coordination with local police officers were better, if there were protocols in place that made it more difficult, this would help thwart even conspiracies. That's my point.
Okay. Makes sense. Plausible. Want to ask you a question I don't think I've heard a libertarian talk about before. What are your thoughts on all the alien disclosures and the hearings we've been seeing out of Congress the last few years? Do you think that's just a distraction to not let us see what's going on with the economy, or the destruction that's coming, distract us from the pandemic and all the problems they had? What's your thoughts on that?
I'm going to give you a different answer than I think most people would, but I'll let you be the judge of that. I don't care. And the reason I don't care is because there's only two possibilities. One is there are aliens that are among us, who are visiting us, who have visited us, who care about us, who pay attention to us, right? And I think that that is a distinct possibility. The other possibility is that there's nothing there, right? And consider that our science, our physics, suggests that it's impossible for anyone to have visited us. You know, they're too far away. Our technology can't even contemplate how it would be effectuated. It's just impossible. Okay, but let's focus on the first one. If aliens have been among us, have visited, are in communication of any sort, either they are benign, they wish us well, or they don't. If they don't, is there anything that we're going to do about it? No. Our technology suggests that they can't even be here. The difference in technology would be so profound, it would be quite literally indescribable. There is no amount of us being nice that's going to change the outcome, I think is my point. Similarly, I don't like all this expenditure of resources on communicating. If they want to communicate with us, they're going to communicate with us. And if they don't want to, they're not going to. The technology is so lopsided that no amount of us hand waving is going to get their attention if they don't want it already. If they have visited us, if they're among us, and they have decided not to explicitly communicate with us, then we're just going to have to face the cold reality that they're just not into us, that we're just not of interest to them, that they just don't care. Yes, thankfully, they're apparently benign, right? They don't want us all dead. If they wanted us all dead, we would be dead. So apparently they don't want that. And life is going to go on. If they decide at some point in the future that we're worthy of their communication, then that's going to happen. But I just don't see anything that we can do to increase the probability of that in the future.
Your bio on your website. Now, maybe I'm digging too deep here and I have a woman brain and I'm pulling out things that doesn't even exist. But it clearly stated that you have one wife. And I thought, are you making a dig at politicians who have, I don't know, 3 like Trump or like RFK? And if so, do you believe there's some sort of moral litmus test that should disqualify someone from office when they're thinking about voting for someone?
No, actually, I was not making. It is an interesting take. I was actually making fun of the numbers involved. But to your point, I do not believe that there should be a particular moral litmus test. I think that there should be overall. In other words, I wouldn't pick out one thing. How do I say? We've all made mistakes. We all do make mistakes. in the faith in which I grew up, we recognized that we were all sinners, that, it's up to us to try to walk, the path that our Father wants of us, but that we're not going to do a very good job of it, best efforts notwithstanding, but that doesn't excuse us from making that best effort. Having said all of that, I think that it is up to us not to judge based on some particular small thing, and I don't mean to say small, but some particular thing, when it is such a complicated decision. But I would also hasten to add, and I'd be interested in your take on this actually, that we shouldn't be entrusting so much to our government that we feel like we need to be so careful that, oops, if our president has a character flaw, we're really going to be in trouble. The reason I think that we feel this way, especially in the United States, more so than in other nations, is because we have given over so much power to our federal government. I don't think you would fear to the same extent, and in cases I recognize I'm wrong about this, but in most cases we don't fear our mayor having as many character flaws, right? The mayor doesn't have the authority over our lives, takes a third of our resources, puts us into wars, right? Tolerates a Federal Reserve System that causes this inflation, that signs off on all this spending that undermines the futures of our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. These are huge decisions. The mayor doesn't have that authority. And so if you found out that the mayor were, I don't know, a convicted felon, had maybe family problems, you might say, well, that stinks, but they're a good administrator, and all I want them to do is to do a good job of running the fire department. You might say that's tolerable. And I would like to get us back to a place with our federal government that suggests that we're not entrusting these people with such important decisions over our lives. That may be a little bit optimistic.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, we do kind of act like the president is our daddy, and our everyday life depends on the mood he's in. And it's not fun to live like that.
And we shouldn't be, well, that's actually well said. And we shouldn't be positioning ourselves as such. I have flaws and I've made mistakes, and I'm going to make mistakes in the future. Best efforts notwithstanding, I promise. Should they be disqualifying? It makes me much more nervous to suggest that what I really want to do is increase my authority over your resources. That would, if you were to show me a candidate with an absolute flawless history of character, and then she or he said, and I want to increase your tax rates, and I want to increase how much of your resources I want to spend at the federal level, now I got a problem. And that's fundamental, that's core, that's character, that's how you see the world. If you don't trust me with my resources, I can't trust you. I don't care, how much time you spend in church.
Okay, last question here. It's about age. Chase, you're the guy on the top of the ticket. He is very young. He's in his 30s, right? He's a millennial running for office. Quite a drastic change from our...
I think he's 39 at the moment.
Okay, yeah. So quite a change from RFK and Trump and even Biden, who dropped out. And I don't love super old people who can barely walk running for office, but I think sometimes the discussion turns, you can go too young. I've known enough 30-something-year-old men in my life that it scares me to death to think that one of them would be running the country. I think wisdom comes with age. To quote my mother, I like my pilots and my presidents to have a little gray hair. What is your response to the, I don't want to vote for Chase Oliver, he has good ideas, but I think he's just too young to run the country?
Chase Oliver isn't running to run the country. Chase Oliver is running to change the way that federal government works. And in that sense, it requires very, very profound change. And profound change like that, you're just not going to get from old school politicians. It's possible that an old politician will bring the kind of change that you want. But I don't believe it's a coincidence that Chase Oliver is a relatively young man and has fresh new ideas. I think that he is not wed to party politics of the past with, weird rules about who can do what. He's not wed to the past to a bunch of rules about how the government should be spending money. And I think that that is a good thing. I think that that dovetails, the policy framework that he seeks to bring to Washington dovetails with his own personal background of not being tied down to political apparatus of the Republican or Democratic Party.
Do you have anything you want to tell the audience, what they can do if they like your ideas, where to go to support the campaign?
Well, I appreciate that. You can check out the campaign. We have a couple of websites I think that your audience will enjoy. You can go to ter.maat.com, which is a little bit tricky to spell because ter Maat has two A's in it, but you can go there. You can go to votechaseoliver.com. Either one, you can link back and forth. We also have what I think your audience would enjoy, an artificial intelligence bot called Lisa, the Libertarian Intelligence System application, that is at libertarianintelligence.org. You can go to libertarianintelligence.org and ask Lisa fun questions about public policy and get answers back that are very much the way a libertarian would answer. It is both a toy and a tool. And so I think that your audience might enjoy that. So check it out. And if anyone wants to get involved with the campaign, go to MikeTerMaat.com, reach out to me. If you got some money that's annoying you and you want to get rid of it, there's a good way to do that there too.
Now that you know where we've been, find out where we're going. Tune in to Ladies Love Politics, where you can stay informed without going insane.